Welcome back to AM Agenda. Joining me now from Canberra, the Parliamentary Secretary for Climate Change and Energy Efficiency, Mark Dreyfus, and the Liberal MP, Paul Fletcher. Good morning to you both. Mark Dreyfus, let's start with you. What do you think lost it for John Brumby in your home state of Victoria?
I think it shows, Ashley, that voters are setting a very high standard for governments around Australia in terms of delivery, and I think you'd have to add to that that the Brumby government, following on the Bracks government, had been in office for 11 years. What I would say about this state election result that we've just had in Victoria is that it shows that voters right around Australia, but particularly in Victoria, are able to make a very clear distinction between federal issues and state issues because, of course, we had a federal election in Victoria just 3 months ago with very, very different results, including in the all-important southeast of Melbourne, where my seat's located. We had very different results.
How much harder will it be, do you think, for Julia Gillard, though, and her reform agenda with another Liberal Premier around the COAG table?
It's looking likely, as your news reporter there in Melbourne's just been saying, that there's going to be a change of government, and that we will be dealing with a Liberal state government in Victoria, but we will continue to work on our health reform agenda with that government. And we'd be indeed expecting cooperation from the new Victorian government because the health reform agenda offers very, very direct advantages for Victorians.
Fletcher, do you agree with that federal issues didn't play into the Victorian campaign, or do you think that could have been, one of the results, a bit of a throwback to the last election a few months ago with a backlash now a few months in?
Well, I think one of the strong lessons from the Victorian election is that the community votes based upon the capacity of a government to deliver it services and outcomes. And the community votes based upon mainstream concerns like worries about cost of living and service delivery. And I think what we've seen is a rejection of the more esoteric agenda of, for example, the Greens, and also a recognition in the Victorian state election that you can't really rely upon independence if you want outcomes. You've really got to choose a government that will deliver results and focus on what is important to the community. So I think the main federal implication is, if you look at the extent to which the Greens are really driving the agenda of this current Labor government, we've seen a pretty comprehensive rejection of that agenda in the Victorian state election.
Well, that decision to preference the Greens, I guess, Paul Fletcher, was a very controversial one. It did raise some eyebrows in Canberra. Does the Federal Party perhaps need to look at that pretty closely and look at the implications for the next federal poll?
Well, we clearly have a political environment here in Canberra where the Greens are effectively in power. It's the Greens agenda which is being reflected in so many of the issues that the Parliament is debating and that the Gillard government is bringing forward. And we've seen in the Victorian state election over the weekend a pretty comprehensive repudiation of the agenda that the Greens carry forward, because people are concerned about day-to-day common sense issues like the cost of living and basic services being delivered to them by government, and they expect competence and they expect focus on the issues which are of concern to the community.
And I'd say, Ashley, that Paul seems to have forgotten there that Labor stood candidates, sitting members, and in one case a new candidate, in the inner city seats in Melbourne, and I can congratulate my state Labor colleagues for either holding or winning those 4 seats that, of course, the commentators were saying as recently as a week or two ago were likely to go to the Greens. The threatened wave of green over inner city Melbourne did not eventuate, and that's of course an endorsement by voters in those seats of Labor, and it's something that I'd congratulate my colleagues in Victoria for.
And we all know that the real reason that outcome occurred is because of the courageous and principled decision taken by Ted Baillieu and the Liberal Party in Victoria not to preference the Greens.
And it's a pity Paul seems to have forgotten the apparently not courageous and apparently not principled decision that the Liberal Party took in the just past federal election when they preferenced Adam Batt.
Let's look forward, though, looking at the next state poll, of course, in New South Wales. Do you think we'll be having the same conversation about the Liberals stealing power? Do you think this is a sign that the tide is turning, Paul Fletcher?
Well, again, I think the underlying issue, which is an issue that Barry O'Farrell and the state Liberal team in New South Wales are very focused on, is delivery of services competently to the electorate, not engaging in internal games. Now, of course, the electoral system in New South Wales is slightly different to that in Victoria because of the optional preferential voting system. Barry and the team will make the decision, I'm sure, which they consider best serves the interests of the people of New South Wales and maximises the prospects of the Liberal Party and the National Party forming the competent government that New South Wales is so desperately crying out for.
Mark Dreyfus, we've seen the New South Wales Premier, Christina Keneally, going to war over the weekend with the ALP state president in New South Wales. If even the president isn't backing her, are things even worse than we already know?
I think what we know, and I'd go back to the Victorian state election, is that state voters will vote on state issues, and we're going to see in New South Wales state voters voting on the issues that are presented to them.
I can well understand why Mark would be trying to distance federal Labor as much as possible from New South Wales state Labor, but the important point is that no political party can take any outcome for granted, and I know it is absolutely true of Barry O'Farrell and the state Liberals and the Nationals that they are not taking any outcome for granted. They are working hard to demonstrate a capacity to deliver outcomes in the day-to-day services that are so important to voters.
Okay, let's look at why you are both in Canberra. Of course, you've been hauled back for this last day of Parliament. The lower house today, of course, is going to be voting on that amended legislation to structurally separate Telstra. A new study has just been released in London. It's an international study, and it's accused the federal government of misusing research to spruik the national broadband network. It says that the government has grossly overstated the benefits of fibre to the home. Mark Dreyfus, what's your reaction to that report this morning?
I'd say it's just one study, and I'd look at the overwhelming support that we have from business, from the health sector, from the education sector, and from people who understand just the benefits that broadband is going to bring across the country, and say it is just one report. What's important is that this is a really, really significant piece of microeconomic reform. What we're achieving with legislation that Prime Minister Julia Gillard has managed to negotiate through the Senate in the face of obstruction from Paul's party, in the face of obstruction from the Nationals. We have this significant piece of reform, and it's going to pass through the House of Representatives today. And it is an important step towards the national broadband network. I'm not concerned about one piece of disagreement from some report in London.
No doubt you'll be paying very closely attention to that report today. You've been described by the government as the shadow communications minister in Parliament. We saw the Prime Minister has been quoting words from your own book stating that the wholesale owner of the network must not compete in the retail space, which is what this reform, this legislation does aim to accomplish, this structural separation of Telstra today.
And as I've repeatedly said, nowhere in my book do I talk about $43 billion, or what we now know is closer to $50 billion, which is the amount of money which is now proposed to be spent on this network, which is going to completely overbuild the existing network, and there has been no cost-benefit analysis done. So when Mark and others from the Labor Party, with a straight face, call this a piece of microeconomic reform and refuse to submit it to the Productivity Commission for a cost-benefit analysis, when it is the Australian Government's stated policy that any significant decision should be subject to a cost-benefit analysis, when the Governor of the Reserve Bank, Glenn Stevens, on Friday told a parliamentary committee that there ought to be a cost-benefit analysis for this kind of exercise, it really does reveal that this is essentially a political exercise which goes back to the beer coaster on the back of which the sketchy details were first developed by then Prime Minister Kevin Rudd and Stephen Conroy, the broadband minister. This was a political exercise dreamt up in April 2009 to try and cover up the fact that their previous broadband policy, which they took to the election in 2007, had collapsed. A policy which was going to spend $4.7 billion. We are now close to $50 billion. This is an extraordinary amount of money which is proposed to be spent by this government, and they are refusing to conduct even the most basic economic housekeeping in terms of doing a cost-benefit analysis.
Mark Dreyfus, it does seem to beg a belief that we are at this stage of voting finally on the structural separation of Telstra, which will clear the way for the rollout of the NBN to continue, and we still haven't seen that cost-benefit analysis that the opposition and the independents as well have been calling for so long.
Ashley, the government released a summary last week, and as the Prime Minister has said,
cost-benefit analysis, Mark Dreyfus.
and as the Prime Minister has said, the business plan is going to be released in December. There will be ample opportunity for full scrutiny. We've just seen days of debate in the Senate, which was allowed to take place. There will be ample scrutiny of the national rollout, and I'd have to say this about Paul Fletcher. He ought to be ashamed of himself as a former telecommunications company executive, someone that has spoken often in support of the rollout of a national broadband network. He ought to be ashamed of himself for basically misquoting the figures, exaggerating the cost, and suggesting that the benefits that he knows that the national broadband network is going to bring aren't going to be there. There will be immense benefits to every Australian from the national broadband network, and it's about time Paul really lived up to his background, his own technological expertise in this area, and his past statements in this area.
Ashley, you're going to give me the chance to respond to that.
Can I just say,
I am a former telecommunications executive. I've worked in broadband and communications policy for nearly 15 years. That is why I'm so passionately opposed to Labor's plan, which is a very, very bad way to proceed with the work of upgrading
Paul,
Australia's
just to clarify,
broadband
you do
infrastructure.
agree with the structural separation of Telstra, though, and Malcolm Turnbull does too, but that's not going to be reflected in the lower house today.
Malcolm's policy, the Liberal Malcolm has articulated the Liberal Party's policy, and I fully support the policy, and I have written in support of the separation of Telstra. But let's be clear, you do not need to spend nearly $50 billion to achieve the separation of Telstra. What is proposed here is just inexplicable that so much public money would be thrown at this without even the most basic analysis. If the Labor Party wants to bring forward a policy to structurally separate Telstra, by all means let them do that. But let's not pretend that this piece of legislation, which essentially involves holding a gun at Telstra's head to force it to come forward with a, quotes, voluntary structural separation undertaking, which then bribes Telstra with $11 billion of taxpayers' money, which then squanders many tens of billions more in a plan which has not been subject to proper analysis, that is not a good policy, and it is precisely because of my nearly 15 years' experience in this sector, that I am so strongly opposed to what is proposed.
Okay, we are running out of time. I do want to cover off on another issue today. Julia Gillard, as we speak, is delivering a speech this morning. She, in it, is laying out her reform agenda for 2011. She again pushes for a price on carbon and seems to link that to something getting underway and happening next year. She says in 2011 there will be nowhere to hide. Mark Dreyfus, do you really think Labor has a mandate to do this, to put a price on carbon before the next election? Julia Gillard spent a lot of the election campaign saying that she wouldn't do this until the Australian economy and the Australian people are ready for it.
Absolutely, we have. It's very important that there be a price on carbon. We have never wavered from our commitment to putting a price on carbon. We have never wavered from the market approach, just as we have not wavered from...
on before the next election, Mark Dreyfus?
Well, that depends on whether or not we're able, with methodical work and negotiating, which is, of course, what we've had to do over the last 3 months in order to produce the 51 pieces of legislation that have passed through this Parliament since the election. We will continue with that methodical approach. If we can achieve an agreement with the Parliament, however it is composed, then we will be able to put a price on carbon in this term. But I'm not going to put a precise timetable on it, Ashley. What I'm going to say is that we will continue to press methodically for a price on carbon, just as we will continue to take steps for action on climate change, including renewables and including energy efficiency.
Paul Fletcher, report after report does warn that the longer this takes to get going, then the worse it will be for the economy.
Ashley, it's just extraordinary that Mark could claim, quotes, "we have never wavered." What did Julia Gillard say just before the election? She said, "I rule out a carbon tax." This is extraordinary. Labor has been all over the place on this. Kevin Rudd lost his job because of his wavering. There has been consistent wavering, and the fundamental point is this: what's happened to the long-term reform agenda when we see this kind of flicking back and forth for short-term political advantage? So we've had a consistent policy on this. The Coalition has had a consistent policy. Our direct action
blocking and
our
obstruction.
direct action plan on climate change. We took a clear policy to the 2010 election.
The only thing we've seen, Ashley, from the Liberal Party on this is blocking and obstruction. It's the Liberal Party which blocked the emissions trading scheme in the Senate on 3 occasions.
Well, look, I think we are going to look forward to a lot more debate on this issue in 2011. Thank you both for joining us this morning. Enjoy that final day of Parliament, even though it is a few days delayed. Thank you both for your time this morning.
Thanks, Ashley.
Thanks very much.
And we will be bringing you Julia Gillard's speech when we get it. That is all we have for this edition of AM Agenda. I apologise for my coughing fit a little earlier in the show. I hope that didn't disturb your morning. For more politics, you can join Selena Edmonds this afternoon at 12:30 Eastern for Lunchtime Agenda, and Kieran Gilbert will be along at 4:15 for PM Agenda. For now, I'm Ashley Gillan. Thanks for your company.